If she crosses the river, let the ice take her, Todd Powell's voice echoed through the biting, relentless wind. No Omega survives the frostfall anyway. Hidden beneath the roots of an ancient pine, Yeston Morehart held her breath, her trembling hands pressed over her mouth. The crunch of boots faded, but the terror remained. She had stolen nothing but her own life back from Alpha Frank Bates, yet they hunted her like a prize. Shivering, half-starved, she crawled from the shadows and faced the frozen wasteland ahead. She didn't know the territory beyond the river belonged to the Alpha King. She only knew it was her only chance. Every step was a monumental battle against thigh-deep snowdrifts, her muscles screaming in a symphony of exhaustion and malnourishment. For 3 days she had been running. 3 days since she had slipped through the broken iron grating of the Blood Moon Pack's compound, leaving behind the cruel reign of Alpha Frank Bates and the venomous whispers of his Luna Lois Diaz. Frank had treated his Omegas not as wolves, but as currency. When Yeston overheard Lois plotting to trade her to a neighboring, notoriously violent pack to settle a border dispute, Yeston knew she had to run. Now, her lungs burned with the raw cold, each inhalation feeling like swallowed glass. Behind her, the faint, haunting howl of trackers cut through the gale. Todd Powell and Elsie Long. They were the Blood Moon's most relentless hunters. Todd was a brute, driven by a sadistic joy for the chase, while Elsie was cold, calculating, and possessed a nose that could track a drop of blood through a blizzard. Yeston knew that if they caught her, death would be a mercy Frank Bates would not grant. She pushed forward, her numb feet stumbling over unseen roots beneath the powder. The landscape here was alien, a desolate expanse of towering black-barked pines and jagged stone reaching up to pierce a bruised iron-gray sky. This was the Frostfall, the Forbidden Zone. The maps in Frank's study had marked this land with a simple, terrifying warning: the Winter Court. As dusk began to bleed the last remnants of light from the sky, Yeston's strength finally gave out. She collapsed into a snowbank, the cold instantly seeping into her marrow. The urge to close her eyes, to let the freezing numbness pull her into a painless sleep, was overwhelming. But then, a sharp, metallic scent cut through the sterile air of the storm. Wood smoke. Forcing her eyes open, Yeston saw it. A faint, flickering orange glow breaking through the dense curtain of trees. She crawled, her fingers digging into the icy crust, dragging her broken body forward. It was a cabin, built of massive dark logs, sitting squat and formidable against the side of a mountain. There were no lights in the windows, only the faint trail of smoke from the stone chimney. Yeston didn't care who it belonged to. Desperation had stripped away her caution. She dragged herself onto the heavy wooden porch, her frozen fingers fumbling with the iron latch. To her shock, it wasn't locked. She tumbled inside, the heavy door slamming shut behind her, cutting off the howl of the wind. The silence of the cabin was sudden and profound. It was a single, massive room, sparsely furnished but impeccably clean. A massive stone hearth dominated one wall, a bed of embers radiating a life-saving heat. Yeston crawled toward the hearth, curling into a tight ball on the heavy fur rug before it. She was too exhausted to investigate the scent that hung in the air, a scent of sharp pine, ozone, and a deep, terrifying undercurrent of apex predator. She simply closed her eyes, letting the warmth pull her under, unaware that she had just broken into the private hunting lodge of the most feared alpha on the continent. Yeston awoke to the sensation of being watched. It wasn't a gentle awakening. It was the primal, electrifying jolt of prey realizing it is no longer alone. She lay perfectly still, her eyes slitted open. The fire had been stoked. A roaring blaze now filled the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the log walls. And standing by the heavy oak table, staring down at her with eyes the color of a stormy sea, was a man. He was massive, his shoulders broad enough to eclipse the firelight. He wore dark utilitarian clothes, heavy leather and wool, but they did nothing to hide the lethal grace of his stance. His hair was the color of midnight, falling in loose, unruly waves around a face carved from granite. It was a handsome face, striking and aristocratic, but marred by a subtle, jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. This was Zevran Whitshore, the Alpha King of the Winter Court. Yeston didn't know his name, but her wolf whimpered in absolute, terrifying submission. The aura of power rolling off him was suffocating. It was not the loud, boastful cruelty of Frank Bates. It was the quiet, absolute certainty of a storm about to break. "You're bleeding on my rug." His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated against Yeston's ribcage. It wasn't a question, nor an exclamation. It was a cold statement of fact. Yeston scrambled backward, her back hitting the stone of the hearth. I'm sorry," she rasped, her voice cracked and dry. "The storm, I just needed shelter." Zevran took a slow step forward. Yeston flinched, bracing for the blow she was accustomed to receiving. But the blow didn't come. Instead, Zevran crouched down, his movements fluid, keeping a careful distance between them. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring. "You smell of the blood moon," he said, his tone darkening. "Frank Bates's territory. You're a long way from home, little wolf, and you are trespassing in lands where your kind are usually shot on sight." "I have no home," Yeston countered, a sudden desperate spark of defiance igniting in her chest. She surprised herself. Usually she kept her head down, but the sheer terror of being sent back to Frank momentarily eclipsed her fear of the giant before her. "If you're going to kill me, do it. But don't send me back." Zevran's eyes narrowed. He was unpredictable. Most alphas would have struck an omega for such insolence. Instead, a flicker of something unreadable, curiosity, amusement, crossed his stony features. "I don't kill starved, half-frozen omegas," Zevran said, standing up. "It's a waste of my energy. But I also don't harbor runaways. You will heal, and then you will leave." He turned his back to her, walking toward a heavy iron basin to wash his hands. It was a staggering display of dominance, showing his back to a stranger. It meant he didn't view her as a threat. "Eat," he commanded, gesturing blindly to a wooden bowl on the table filled with thick, steaming stew. "Before I decide to throw you back out into the snow." Yeston stared at him, bewildered. He was terrifying, yet he had stoked the fire and offered her food. As she slowly crawled toward the table, her hands shaking as she grasped the warm wooden bowl, she realized the Alpha King was a puzzle she was wholly unprepared to solve. And as Zevran watched her from the corner of his eye, he realized the same about the fragile, defiant Omega who had collapsed on his hearth. For 2 days, Yeston remained a prisoner of the cabin and of the storm raging outside. Zevran came and went, a ghost in the blizzard. He spoke little, his presence a heavy, brooding weight in the room. He provided firewood, fresh meat, and medicinal salves for her frostbitten fingers, but his demeanor remained as frosty as the landscape. On the morning of the 3rd day, the heavy cabin door swung open, but it was not Zevran who entered. 2 wolves stepped out of the blinding white snow. The first was a woman with sharp, angular features and eyes like chipped flint, Heidi Davidson. She moved with the predatory grace of a high-ranking beta. Beside her stood Grant Sullivan, a mountain of a man with a thick auburn beard and a permanent scowl. So the king wasn't exaggerating. A little stray, Heidi sneered, kicking the snow off her boots. Her gaze swept over Yeston, lingering on the faded, ragged clothes. "You don't look like much of a spy. But Lois Diaz is known for her tricky games." Yeston shrank back into the corner of the bed Zevran had allowed her to use. "I'm not a spy. I ran away." "Right," Grant grunted, dropping a heavy sack of supplies on the table. "And I'm a fairy princess. Frank Bates doesn't let his property just wander off. If you're here, it's because he wants you here, or he's coming to get you. Either way, you bring trouble to our borders." "Grant," Zevran's voice cut through the room as he materialized in the doorway, a freshly killed stag slung over his massive shoulder. "Leave her." Heidi crossed her arms. "Alpha, with respect, this is a risk. Blood moon trackers have been spotted near the southern ridge. Todd Powell and that venomous shadow of his, Elsie Long. They are looking for something. Or someone." Heidi's eyes darted to Yeston. Yeston's breath hitched. Todd and Elsie. They had crossed the border. The phantom pain of Todd's claws raking her back flared to life. "They won't cross the river," Zevran said calmly, dumping the stag onto the floorboards. "They might if the prize is valuable enough," Heidi argued. She walked toward Yeston, her presence oppressive. "Tell me, Omega, why would Frank send his best hunters after you? You're weak, scrawny. What did you steal?" "Nothing," Yeston cried out, her voice trembling. "I stole nothing. I just wanted to be free. He was going to trade me to the Iron Fang pack." Silence fell over the room. Even Grant's scowl faltered. The Iron Fangs were notorious. Being traded to them was a death sentence. Zevran stepped between Heidi and Yestin, his sheer size forcing Heidi to take a step back. He looked down at Yestin, his storm-gray eyes searching her face. He was searching for a lie, a tremor of deception. Yestin met his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs, letting him see the raw, unfiltered terror in her soul. Zevran's expression didn't soften, but the tension in his shoulders shifted. He turned back to his betas. Double the patrols on the southern ridge. If Powell or Long cross the river, take their heads. Heidi looked shocked. Alpha, killing them is an act of war. They are trespassing on Winter Court land, Zevran growled, the alpha power bleeding into his voice, making the timber of the cabin vibrate. My law is absolute. Go. As Grant and Heidi quickly bowed and exited the cabin, Yestin stared at Zevran's broad back. He was unpredictable. He was a tyrant who threatened her with the cold, yet he was just prepared to start a war to keep her hunters at bay. Why? Yestin whispered. Zevran turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the firelight. Because I despise Frank Bates, he replied coldly. Don't mistake my politics for pity, Omega. But as he walked away, Yestin noticed he had quietly placed a fresh blanket at the foot of her bed. The fever broke on the 5th day. Yestin's strength began to return, and with it, her restless nature. She couldn't stand being idle. While Zevran was out patrolling, she cleaned the cabin top to bottom, mended his torn hunting leathers with meticulous stitches, and prepared meals using the supplies Grant had left. When Zevran returned that evening, brushing the snow from his dark hair, he stopped in his tracks. The cabin smelled of roasted root vegetables and herbs. His torn tunic sat folded perfectly on the table. He looked at Yestin, who was nervously sweeping the hearth. You didn't have to do this, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. I have to earn my keep, Yestin replied softly, not meeting his eyes. Omegas who don't work don't eat. That was the rule. Zevran moved across the room, stopping directly in front of her. He gently but firmly took the broom from her hands. That is not the rule here, he said, his eyes burning with an intense, unreadable emotion. You are not a slave in the Winter Court. The proximity of him was overwhelming. The scent of pine and ozone was intoxicating. Yestin looked up, her breath catching as she saw the raw intensity in his gaze. For a fleeting second, the terrifying Alpha King melted away, leaving behind a man who looked incredibly tired and incredibly lonely. Who gave you that scar? Yestin asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Zevran stiffened. The air grew cold. But instead of roaring, he reached up, his fingers brushing the jagged line on his face. A betrayal, he said quietly. Someone I trusted, someone I loved. They taught me that vulnerability is a weakness an alpha cannot afford. He looked at Yestin, really looked at her. He saw the faded bruises on her wrists, the defensive posture she always assumed. We are both scarred by the people who were supposed to protect us, Yestin. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded different on his tongue. Not a command, not a slur, but a recognition. A spark, dangerous and electric, ignited in the space between them. Zevran's hand slowly reached out, his knuckles brushing against her cheek. His touch was shockingly gentle, a jarring contrast to his monstrous reputation. Yestin closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth of his palm. Suddenly, a massive, thunderous howl shattered the peace of the night. Zevran's hand snapped away, his head whipping toward the window. The softness vanished, replaced instantly by the lethal predator. Todd, Yestin gasped, panic seizing her chest in an icy grip. Stay here, Zevran commanded, moving swiftly to grab his heavy winter cloak and a massive silver-edged broadsword from the wall. You can't go alone. He has Elsie. They set traps. Yestin panicked, grabbing his arm. Zevran looked down at her hand on his sleeve. I am the king of the Winter Court, he said, his eyes flashing with feral gold. I am the trap. He tore out the door, plunging into the blizzard, leaving Yestin alone with the terrifying realization that if Zevran fell, she would be dragged back to hell. The snow was stained crimson by the time Yestin reached the southern ridge. She couldn't stay in the cabin. The walls felt like a cage, and the silence was deafening. She knew Elsie Long's tactics intimately. The female tracker never fought fair. She used neurotoxic poison darts that numbed a wolf's senses, turning the strongest fighters into paralyzed prey. Zevran was a powerhouse of a king, but he didn't know the dishonorable, underhanded ways the Blood Moon Pack waged war. Using the stealth and evasion skills she had honed over years of sneaking around Frank's compound unseen, Yestin moved silently through the dense, snow-laden pines. Her breath plumed in the freezing air, her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She crested a small, rocky embankment and looked down upon a clearing near the frozen winding river that served as the border between the territories. It was a scene of chaotic, brutal violence. To her left, Grant Sullivan and Heidi Davidson were engaged in a desperate, vicious skirmish with at least a dozen Blood Moon enforcers. Grant was a whirlwind of auburn fury, tossing men aside, while Heidi moved with lethal precision. But they were vastly outnumbered, slowly being pushed back toward the tree line. But it was the center of the frozen river that made Yeston's blood run cold. Zevran stood alone, his heavy winter cloak discarded on the ice, surrounded in a wide circle by Blood Moon's elite guard. Across the shimmering, treacherous ice stood Frank Bates himself. The Blood Moon Alpha was a tall, sinewy man whose cruelty had carved harsh lines into his face. Beside him crouched Todd Powell, nursing a deeply lacerated shoulder that dripped dark blood onto the snow. And lurking slightly behind Frank, blending into the shadows of the bank, was Elsie Long, a slender blowgun poised dangerously close to her lips. "You violate the ancient treaty, Witchshore," Frank shouted, his voice cracking like a whip over the howling wind. "Hand over the Omega and we retreat in peace. She is my property. You harbor a thief." She is under my protection," Zevran roared. He held a massive silver-edged broadsword easily in one hand, the metal gleaming lethally in the moonlight. Yet, from her vantage point, Yeston noticed what Frank could not, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in Zevran's stance. He was favoring his left leg. A tiny, dark dart already protruded from the thick leather armor at his thigh. Elsie had already hit him. The neurotoxin was working its way into his bloodstream. "Protection?" Frank laughed, a grating, ugly sound that echoed off the mountains. "Since when does the unfeeling Winter King care for the dregs of our society? You execute trespassers on sight, yet you're willing to break our generations-old truce and start a war over a worthless, scrawny runt?" "I won't ask twice, Frank." Zevran's voice dropped, becoming a terrifying, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate the very ice beneath their feet. "Cross back over the river, or drown beneath it." Frank sneered, raising a hand. It was a silent command. Elsie moved, swift and fluid as a viper. She stepped out of the shadows, raising the blowgun, aiming directly for the exposed, vulnerable gap in Zevran's armor at the side of his neck. Zevran, his reflexes noticeably dulled by the venom already coursing through his veins, began to turn, raising his sword, but Yeston could see the terrible truth. He wouldn't be fast enough to dodge this one. A hit to the neck would be fatal. "No!" Yeston screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and desperate. She burst from the tree line, a blur of motion sprinting onto the slippery, treacherous ice. She didn't think about her own safety. She didn't consider the pain or the terror of Frank Bates. She only saw the man who had offered her a warm hearth when the world had offered her only ice. She threw herself into the space between Zevran and the deadly projectile just as Elsie exhaled. The sharp burning sting of the dart bit deeply into Yeston's upper shoulder. The impact threw her off balance, her feet slipping on the ice. She collapsed backward, hitting a solid wall of muscle. Zevran caught her. His broadsword clattered to the ice as his large arms wrapped around her small frame, his storm-gray eyes widening in absolute, earth-shattering shock. "Yeston! I wouldn't let them take you," she mumbled. The world instantly began to tilt and spin as the highly potent neurotoxin flooded her system, dragging her down into darkness. Across the ice, Frank Bates's eyes widened in furious disbelief. "You stupid, broken thing. Grab her, Todd. Get the girl." Todd surged forward, his boots finding purchase on the ice, a sadistic grin splitting his face. But as Yeston went limp in Zevran's arms, the Alpha King's shock morphed into something entirely different. The tremor in his leg vanished, overridden by pure adrenaline. The cold, calculated political Alpha King disappeared. In his place stood a force of primal, catastrophic rage. His eyes burned with a blinding, incandescent gold cutting through the dark night. The air around him seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. Frost exploded outward from his boots in jagged, crystalline spikes, freezing the river solid and sending a shockwave of biting cold across the clearing. "Grant! Heidi!" Zevran's roar was no longer human. It was the deafening sound of a mountain collapsing. "Leave none of them alive!" Zevran gently, almost reverently, laid the unconscious Yeston on the ice, wrapping his own thick cloak securely around her. Then he stood. He didn't bother picking up his sword, his claws extended, long and brutal. With a terrifying snarl that sent half the Blood Moon pack scrambling backward in sheer terror, the Alpha King of the Winter Court charged Frank Bates. The true war had begun, and it was going to be a massacre. Yeston awoke to a sensation she had never experienced in her entire life, absolute, encompassing comfort. She wasn't surrounded by the abrasive, smoky heat of a small hearth, nor the freezing chill of the dungeons. It was a deep, soothing warmth. She slowly opened her eyes, her vision swimming through a haze of confusion until it finally locked onto an ornate, high-vaulted ceiling, masterfully painted with intricate silver constellations. She was no longer in the hunting cabin. She was lying in a massive, opulent bed, draped in furs and heavy silk sheets. She tried to sit up, a sharp groan escaping her dry lips as a dull, lingering throb pulsed in her shoulder where the dart had struck. Immediately, a shadow moved at the periphery of her vision. Large, warm hands were there, gently but firmly, pressing her shoulders back against the plush pillows. Do not move. The poison is finally out of your system, but your body is still incredibly weak. Zevran was sitting in a heavy velvet chair, pulled flush against the side of the bed. He looked entirely different from the pristine king she had first met. He looked battered and exhausted. A fresh, shallow cut tracked across his high cheekbone, and his left arm was bound in clean white linen. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes, suggesting he hadn't slept in days. But his storm-gray eyes were alight with an emotion Yeston had never expected to see directed at her. Relief. Absolute, profound relief. The battle! Yeston rasped, her voice a dry whisper. Panic flared in her chest. Frank! Todd! Edai. Is over, Zevran said quietly, his voice a soothing rumble. He reached over to a silver nightstand, pouring a glass of water and gently helping her sit up just enough to drink. Frank Bates is dead. He will never hurt you or anyone else again. Todd and Elsie surrendered when they saw their alpha fall. They are currently rotting in the lower dungeons, awaiting trial by my Beta Council. The rest of the Blood Moon pack fled back behind their borders in terror. They are leaderless and broken. Yeston stared at him, the water glass trembling in her hands as the sheer magnitude of his words washed over her. She fell back against the pillows, trying to comprehend the impossible. You killed an alpha. You went to war with an entire pack. Over me? You stepped in front of a poisoned dart meant for my throat, Zevran countered, his voice thickening with a raw, unshielded emotion. He leaned closer, the familiar, comforting scent of pine and sharp ozone wrapping around her like a protective shield. You sacrificed yourself for a man you barely knew, a man who threatened to throw you back into the snow. I couldn't let you die, Yeston whispered, looking down at her hands. You were the first person who ever showed me kindness without demanding a price. Zevran let out a heavy, shuddering breath. I thought you were a broken, frightened thing running from shadows. I thought I had to protect you from the world. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. You have more courage, more fierce loyalty in your little finger than Frank Bates had in his entire tainted lineage. I have to go, Yeston panicked suddenly, the deeply ingrained trauma of her past rearing its ugly head. The reality of her situation, an Omega in a king's bedchamber, was crashing down on her. I caused all this death. I'll bring you more political trouble. I'm just an Omega, Zevran. I don't belong in a palace. Your court will never accept me. Stop! Zevran's voice was a soft, firm command. He reached out, taking her trembling hand in both of his. The contrast between his massive, battle-scarred hands and her delicate, calloused ones was stark, yet they fit together as if forged in the same fire. Listen to me, Yeston, Zevran said, his gaze intense and unwavering. I spent years turning my heart to ice. After the betrayal that gave me this scar, I believed that showing mercy, showing love, was a fatal weakness. I built a fortress of ice around myself and my territory, but when I saw you fall on the ice, he closed his eyes, a violent shudder running through his massive frame at the memory. He brought her knuckles to his lips, pressing a desperate kiss against her skin. The thought of losing you, of watching that light extinguish from your eyes, was more terrifying to me than any army I have ever faced. He opened his eyes, and the feral golden light of his wolf was bleeding into the gray, swirling with devotion. My court will accept exactly who I tell them to accept, but this isn't about politics. You are not just an Omega. You are the woman who thawed the Winter King. I am not letting you go. Not now, not ever. "Zevran," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes and spilling over her cheeks. It wasn't fear crying out anymore. It was overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful hope. "Stay," he murmured, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers, his lips hovering a mere breath away. "Not as a prisoner. Not as a stray seeking shelter from a storm. Stay as my equal. Stay as my mate." Yestin looked deep into the eyes of the man who was once the subject of terrifying legends, her greatest fear across the border, and saw only her permanent sanctuary. She didn't need to run anymore. Her weary soul had finally found its home. She reached up, weaving her fingers into the thick, dark waves of his hair, and closed the final distance between them. The kiss was a breathtaking collision of fire and ice, a promise of eternal safety and devotion sealed in the very heart of the winter court. She had fled into the frozen wilderness expecting to die in the snow, but instead, she had found her kingdom and her king. Sometimes, the storms we run from lead us directly to the sanctuaries we never knew existed. Yestin's journey reminds us that vulnerability is not a weakness, but the ultimate catalyst for finding true strength and genuine connection. We often build walls, like Zevran's icy exterior, to protect ourselves from past hurts, only to realize that those walls are keeping out the very warmth we desperately need to heal. In real life, we all have our frostfall, those terrifying unknowns and cold, unforgiving challenges we must face. But if we can brave the storm with a resilient heart, we might just find that the things we feared most are exactly what will make us whole. If you enjoyed this journey into the winter court and found a piece of your own resilience reflected in Yestin's story, please hit that like button, share it with fellow romance and fantasy lovers, and subscribe for more epic tales of love, survival, and unexpected destinies.